Welcome everyone. Welcome to this session of Dualities, the Marriage of Opposites. I'm James Barbieri. I've been Associate Program Director here at the Power Centre and your host throughout this series. As a host, I'm here to help you throughout the call. So any problems, just feel free to just drop me a message in the chat or to Eleanor. Today we have the honour to be joined by Mark Vernon again. Mark is a writer and psychotherapist who presents radio shows and podcasts such as the Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogues with Rupert Sheldrake. With a PhD in ancient Greek philosophy, Mark has authored books such as A Secret History of Christianity, Jesus, The Last Inkling, and the Evolution of Consciousness, which in part explores the work of Barfield, and his latest book, Dante's Divine Comedy, a guide for the spiritual journey. Today, Mark will talk to us about The Master and the Emissary, Dualities in the Philosophy of Iain McGilchrist. Just before we begin, I'd just like to remind everyone to keep your microphone muted during the presentation, but please do keep your camera on. Do use the chat throughout the call. It's going to be open and feel free to share your ideas with the group. If you do feel that the chat has been a bit distracting, you can press the chat button at the bottom of your screen. Finally, this session is recorded for travel purposes and for you all. You should all receive the recording link when it's ready in about 3 days' time. And with that, I'll pass it over to you, Mark. Welcome.
Thank you very much indeed, James, and very nice to be back again for the fourth of my contributions to this wonderful month, considering the nature of dualities. In my talks, we've touched on the role of dualities in the ancient thought of Plato, in the medieval thought of Dante, and in the modern thought of William Blake. And in a way, today, for this fourth talk, I'm going to turn to a major contribution in the postmodern world, that of Iain McGilchrist, which is in a way a substantial, if not massive, correction in terms of how we attend to the world. And as you'll see, if it isn't already fairly familiar to you already, the role of dualities in that correction is the basis of Iain's contribution. And it first came to widespread awareness with the publication of his book, I think a decade or more ago now, The Master and His Emissary. And as we'll see, it's been extended in a second major publication, which came out at the end of last year. So let me switch to some slides. And I hope you can see that. I'm just calling up my own notes on a separate screen, which I have to do when sharing slides this way. So there we are, yeah. Excuse me, I'd forgotten to do this. Here we are, yeah, okay. So to begin with the science, the neuroscience in particular, that Iain lays out so carefully, which he does both in his original book, The Master and His Emissary, and in the new one, The Matter with Things. He's very concerned to ground this in science, but to extend it way beyond what is often taken to be the science. So in a way, that is why it's a postmodern move. What he does, in effect, is to take what was a largely forgotten or marginal aspect of particularly brain science, which is the notion of brain lateralisation, the observation that brains, not just human brains, but all what you might call advanced animals, I guess, brains are split down the middle, and wonder why that might be the case. And in particular, he uses the insight from a Nobel Prize winner, actually, Roger Sperry, who treated the two hemispheres as if they were two subpersonalities. And so therefore don't do different things, but see the world in different ways. This is a key insight from Iain's thought. It's not as if the left hemisphere does reason and the right hemisphere does emotion, for example, as is sometimes said. Both hemispheres are involved in all things, but they do with very different takes on the world, different qualities of attention. And it's the combination of the two that make for an expansive consciousness. So the left hemisphere, you might say, following Roger Sperry, is a bit like a person who loves precision. They think the purpose in life is primarily to manipulate it. They seek certainty and gain certainty by making maps of reality or forming heuristics that they then adhere to as rules and take that as reality. There is an inherent limitation in those abstractions, but they are handy fictions, and we all use them to substantial degrees in order to find our way through the world. You might say it's the side of us that longs to make the world our own by conceptualizing or feeling it's familiar or treating it as if it were our own. That's the qualities that the personality of the left hemisphere has in this model of the two hemispheres, but which is also familiar to at least part of ourselves. But we probably also have a way of relating to the world which is much more closely associated with the right hemisphere. And this is the side of us that can make connections, that can build links, particularly into the unknown. And so it seeks an understanding that can reach out. So it's the side of us perhaps that enjoys possibilities and novelty. It's a side of us that can remain uncommitted to the nature of things. It's Keats's famous negative capability that can exist without the need to reach after fact and certainty. So it can stay alert to the world. It's not just mystification for its own sake. It is about trying to be more in touch with reality, but with the awareness that much of that will appear, at least in the first instance, as a kind of mystery. You might say that the right is expectant and receives. That's its dominant mode of relating. Now, Iain looks at why these two hemispheres have evolved from an evolutionary point of view, at least. And the argument there would be that we need both kinds of attention to survive. So the left hemisphere gives us that narrower focus and supports our capacity to take from the world what we need to take from the world in order to survive. But the right offers the capacity to maintain a sustained and open engagement. He often looks at the different functions of the hemispheres in the bird that's feeding, and the left hemisphere needs to be able to pay the narrow attention that can pick the grain off the ground, whereas the right hemisphere needs to keep an open awareness onto the world to make sure that it itself is not picked off the ground to become food for some other creature. Now, when for us, these two ways of relating to the world are in a creative tension, they can be put together and create the brilliant capacities that we have to stand back from reality whilst remaining a part of it. And I think this is the appeal of the art that brings both these capacities together and makes us feel like we're seeing something that's rich and full. Here's the picture of the Mona Lisa and Ghirlandaio's old man and a grandson. And they do that for us. There's both the particular features of the individual, but then opening onto the familiar expansive backgrounds of Renaissance art with their turning roads and rivers, their distant blue horizons. They appeal both to what we can know and what remains unknown. And so speaks to us not just of a scene, but also of life itself we know something at least of the particularities of this moment, but can also be aware of what we don't understand about what's happening now even, let alone what might happen in the future. And that's the appeal of this, the benefit of this right, left, right kind of exchange as it's described in more neuroscience terms. It deepens experience and produces a kind of seamless self-consciousness by being able to embrace both wills, both personalities of the two hemispheres. It's also, I think, the quality of consciousness that's fostered by mindfulness or other meditative practices. Here's a picture of Thich Nhat Hanh, sometimes called one of the founding figures in mindfulness, who recently died. And mindfulness, if you've ever done this, is about fostering the capacity to be aware of thoughts and feelings, as well as actually having those thoughts and feelings, so that the experience and the experiencer are held together, but held together with a distinctiveness. And so being able to draw on the steadier, reliable element, which is the experiencer, and not just get swept along by what is being experienced. So this is important to notice. It's not a separating of experiencer from experienced, but experiencing in a different way. So it's not about trying to cut off part of reality. That might be a subtle error that is easy to make in meditation, but actually is fostering the more left hemisphered approach to things. The full capacity fostered in the skillful meditator, someone who incorporates it into their life, not just when they're sat on the cushion, is that they can know that the mind is one thing and embodiment is another, but that both can be fully embraced rather than divided. You might say that it's not about bringing things together in reality. There's nothing in a way to bridge, but there is everything to see. And so I think spiritual paths in their maturer forms are not about actually integrating different aspects of reality, as if dualities must somehow be linked up in some sort of synthesis. Rather, I think it's about the perceptual transformation that can see the whole, but in its particularities. And so I like images such as Jacob's Stairway to Heaven, because I think they show the spiral nature of this ascent. Blake would say it's going beyond Beulah, which tries to marry in relationships of love and combination, and using that as just a stepping stone into the vision of eternity, where dualities themselves are transcended, but transcended through the duality, because that doesn't collapse reality into a singular, undynamic, static worldview. And again, it's one of the reasons why spiritual transformation is difficult. It's not just about bringing together what we already know through the two hemispheres, left and right, but it's about the combination that makes from a different perspective altogether without loss of content through the practice. Now, we saw this in Dante's Purgatory, particularly if you remember this image where Dante is about to step into the flames of the seventh terrace and has to be encouraged by Virgil, because he is told that on the other side of the flames lies a wholly different perception of things. The flames will enable a greater capacity. And so with Iain's insights in mind now, that reminds us that struggle is part of the transformation. Even suffering can be part of spiritual transformation, because it's about letting go what we know, even letting go a capacity to embrace more than what we know, through a process of coming to a different reality altogether. You might say it's a bit like the struggles of growing up, that The child can be curious, adventurous even, but still concerned and worried, because its curiosity and adventure must be able to reach into realities of which it has no perception at all at the moment. And that is always a concerning thing. There's always a fear of loss, because in a way there is a loss, but it's a loss that's regained because it brings the earlier perception into dialogue with a new perception. And so we can, as an adult, take on the attitude of a child that's not childish, that doesn't lose the adult qualities, but is open like the child. But in the adult life, it's one that lifts and expands rather than just say explores. You need, you might say, the confidence that light and life and the source of all things exceed the darkness or the death or the experience, at least, of destruction, which can be part of spiritual life. Spiritual awareness is about growing through these intuitions, combined with discernment, combined with reason, combined with emotion, as we've been saying, considering Plato, Dante, and Blake. Now, this is captured in the spiritual traditions as well, and one of the great joys of Iain's book is how he doesn't just stay with the neuroscience, but links it back to older perceptions that have been articulated and shows how the neuroscience chimes with that. Here's one that I particularly like from Dennis the Areopagite, where he writes, "The tradition of the theologians is twofold. On the one hand, ineffable and mystical, on the other, manifest and more knowable. The ineffable is interwoven with what can be uttered. The one persuades and contains within itself the truth of what it says. The other affects and establishes the soul with God by initiations that do not teach anything." So that just teases out a little more what this experience is like, of the unity of left and right perception, when the one, the left, persuades and contains within itself the truth of what it says. It is in touch with reality, but in what you might call a closed system context, whereas the other affects and establishes the soul with God, with the whole, with the all. And that's often as much by initiations, such as Dante stepping through the fire, that don't teach you anything, but that open your perceptual or attentive capacities that can then be drawn in order to be discerned and taught to yourself, or through the instruction of another, start to make more and more sense. It's the kind of learning where you have to be able to reflect on experience, not just be told, because if you are told, it either makes no sense or seems perhaps too simple. But when it's combined with this kind of expansive experience, then you start to realize the deeper truth of it. Now, this is also to stress, if this sounds a bit abstract and esoteric, the importance of the body in spiritual practice. And it's often actually through embodied practices that these things are established in the soul. We've seen in Plato how love is crucial. There's an image there, if you could just about make it out, of Socrates being taught by Diotima, who we're told knew the arts of loving. It's very, very significant that Socrates is not just a rational figure, but is a great lover and had that desire for more, that love for the good, the beautiful, and the true, awoken in him by an experience of the embodied presence of love within him, initiated, so Plato tells us, by Diotima, the priestess of love. And similarly, we saw with Dante how it was a very embodied, tortuous experience of seeing Beatrice on the streets of Florence that awoke that side of things within him. His ascent, described in the Divine Comedy, would not have even begun without that embodied experience, both on the streets of Florence and in the presence of Beatrice. And there's a neurological explanation for this, which Iain talks about, and that is that the right hemisphere is more connected to the body than the left hemisphere. Both the left and the right produce maps of our embodied awareness, and in particular, the left-hand side of our body tends to connect to the right hemisphere for that side of its purpose, and the right side of the body tends to connect to the left hemisphere for this mapping. But the right hemisphere does more. It carries a whole body sense that's intimately linked to lived and affective experience. That's how we are able to make connections through empathy, be that with others or with the world at large. So that's one way in which the neuroscience supports these intuitions that many people have had over many years. It's another important side of this new stress on the embodied practices in spiritual reflection. It is partly conceptual, it is partly rational, that's necessary for discernment, but it needs, you might say, the energy that comes and is felt most keenly in the body as well, be that the draw of beauty or indeed the impact of suffering. Both can propel us to seek new visions of the world. It's why spiritual practices are often embodied, at least the ones that tend to bring conversions or epiphanies. Here's an image of pilgrims setting off. And the writer on the history of religion, Robert Bellah, has talked about this very interestingly. He thinks that play was an important part in human evolution. He calls it the time when we weren't just fighting to survive, what he calls online time, but were able to relax and take a step back from the business of living in what he calls offline time. And again, you get the echoes there of left and right hemisphere with the online and the offline. And that moment of offline enabled the play that enabled us to experiment with our sense of reality. Experiment both through ritual as well as through reason. And it's why practices like pilgrimage, like rituals, like attending liturgies, lighting candles, bowing down, raising hands, they're all a crucial part of spiritual perception, not just a nice to have if that's your kind of thing. As Blaise Pascal famously remarked, the heart has its reasons, that reason doesn't understand. And he also made this remark that if you want to believe, go to church. He wasn't necessarily meaning go to a particular church, but what he was meaning was that you've got to take part in this tradition, in its ritual and embodied ways. That's a crucial part of exposing yourself to what the tradition has to offer, that you then discern. This is not about submission, but it is about stepping into with all that you are. Now, Iain then describes our predicament now as he sees it through the modernity that Blake lived at the beginning of, gone crazy, and gone crazy particularly by prioritizing the perception of the left hemisphere as a whole. And this is the myth of the master and his emissary that he uses in the first book. The story basically is that a master, a wise ruler, his domains grew too large, and so trained emissaries to look after parts of his world, and that the emissaries then, though rather than being in the service of the master, decided to seize control of their smaller domains themselves, and growing cocky, overreach, and even try to depose and overturn the master. So there's a kind of evolutionary cyclical sense in this story. If you notice that it's the wise ruler to start with, because of their wisdom, their reach in the world grows, but there's always this tendency for that reach to become a kind of authority under itself that then thinks it understands, disconnected from the whole. And that's when the trouble comes about. And Iain uses this story to say that we now live in a period where we're at one end of this story, and it leads to a perception of the world that's dominated by the left hemisphere, that thinks everything is just objects, everything is inert, everything is detached, that the truest path to truth is by reductive analysis of things, taking it apart, standing back, objectifying the world, and also leads to dualism in the modern sense, rather than dualities, which we've been considering. And dualism is marked by being unsure how things connect up again, that then leads to the tendency to eliminate one or other of the dualisms in order to try to get a grasp on the contradiction seeming of the dualism. So the best known of those is in the post-Cartesian world, it's been taken that reality is composed of things and of mental stuff, and that because it's harder to get traction on the mental stuff, particularly through the use of modern technology, that tends to get discounted, if not discarded altogether, and the world is treated as if it were a complex system of things that can be manipulated through the technology that we prioritize so much. Iain McGilchrist calls it hemispheric utilization bias. The left has, as it were, imposed its view on the world at a cultural level now, not just the individual level. And I like this image of the Copernican universe, not just because it shows the sun at the center of all things, which of course is a truth about the solar system, but because the human figures contemplating this world are now on the outside, at least in their minds, of the cosmos, and are excluded from the direct experience, the participation with that which they're studying. And so this map inadvertently shows the downside of the modern world, as well as its great discovery. We can study the world, but don't know quite how to join in with the world that we're studying. And this produces radical skepticism and the possibility of meaninglessness. So we're confused by Magritte's famous image, called actually the treachery of images, sometimes called "This is not a pipe" because of what's written on it. But it really poses for us, what can we trust in this split world? Do we trust the words, which we're quite inclined to, but then we have the image and aren't quite sure how the image sits with the words, how the appearance goes alongside with the description of the appearance. It makes it hard to find the resources as well to step into the unknown when it comes to a wider world view. We lose the sophisticated uses of love or beauty, or indeed suffering, that figures like Dante and Blake wrote so much about, because we get stuck at this kind of flipping level. Is this a pipe or is this not a pipe? Is this world dead? Is it alive? Is it described best by abstraction, or can we trust experience? We've lost a lot of the wisdom with this reduction of our perception that Iain McGilchrist so brilliantly describes by thinking about the personality of the left brain. Now, it was also a big concern in a different way, different language, of course, but of David Bohm. And in this conversation with Owen Barfield that he had in May 1982, it comes up quite a lot, where David Bohm talks about knowledge that's become forced into grooves and compartments as a form of distortion. And the reason why knowledge in grooves and compartments distorts our knowledge of the world is because it holds us in a kind of fixed rigidity. And ultimately, David Bohm said it leads to self-deception as well. And he contrasts that with the intelligence that involves paying attention to what is between the categories, what's not contained in the grooves, and how we have to be able to negate what we know quite as much as to embrace what we know, to see the limitations of our current categories and models in order to reach beyond them, to see what you might call the edge of words, as well as the words themselves. And, you know, this is a psychological truth as well. David Bohm, in the same conversation, talks about is why positive thinking is so superficial if you just go for happiness the whole time. He says, you know, all these admonitions to think positively all the time, they may make you cheerful, but they lead you into very fixed categories. So this is the kind of fixed grin of the person that's trying to stay positive all the time, partly because they've lost this capacity to know that suffering might be a pathway to follow as well. It's this excluding, eliminating approach to life rather than embracing, saying yes. And so it's a spiritual truth as well that David Bohm and Owen Barfield discuss. David Bohm says, wholeness is not finally, ultimately capable of being grasped as an absolute totality. Wholeness itself, he says, is unbroken, seamless, free, but as a flow of action and thought. In that reaching to what is beyond our awareness at the moment, we have to enter a flow of being. So that's a clue as to what it's like not just to get lost in a kind of stuck mystification about things, but when that morphs into a sense of stepping deeper into a mystery, step by step, the light exposing something we hadn't seen before, the mind understanding something we hadn't seen before, that enables the next step into that which is beyond. Flow and interdependence, dynamism are the hallmarks of overcoming the stuckness which so characterizes much of the modern world. Iain McGilchrist talks about needing to see that opposites eventually coincide like parallel lines at the horizon. The real world is not linear, it's not progressive in a straightforward way, it's not just about growth, it's more about cycles and spirals and polarities. And this is also why, at a cultural level, differences are overcome not by a race to the lowest common denominator, but precisely by seeing reality in all its diversity, with all its differences, and discovering the whole that actually embraces what seem like both sides of the coin. And the Dalai Lama and Desmond Tutu were well known for this. We've recently seen images of them laughing together again because of Desmond Tutu's death. And they love to josh about their differences as much as laugh and love about their similarities that they discovered through their differences, rather than because they tried to push them to one side. So going back to some of the quotes that Iain uses, which expand on this in another way, he quotes often the American pragmatist philosopher C.S. Peirce, who wrote, "A thing without oppositions, ipso facto, does not exist. Existence lies in its opposition." And you can think about things like mountains and valleys, existence that lies in opposition, skin that separates and connects, delimitation, separation being part of bringing into being, like, say, the gestation of the fetus in the womb that gradually separates from the mother and so comes into being. In a slightly different way, the bird flies by pushing against the air. The rocket is propelled through space with a different kind of opposition, Newton's law that says that every action has an equal and opposite reaction. That's part of that movement too, even. And you might say that hence Peirce says, without opposition, existence is not possible. Another quote that Iain uses to draw out that's another significance of this is this remark of Niels Bohr, the physicist: it is the hallmark of any deep truth that its negation is also a deep truth. This is an insight from what you might call intuitive logic rather than classical logic. Intuitive logic knows that two things that seem to be opposed can actually be true at a deeper level. It's sometimes called the law of the excluded middle in classical logic. Well, that so-called excluded middle comes back with intuitive logic. Experientially, you know it in phrases like freedom is perfect service, in fact, rather than freedom being free of service or slavery. You know, this is to think about things like the nature of free will, which is not simply about doing what we want, because doing what we want might well seduce us into cutting off from the source of our life, from the being that's round about us, and confusing freedom with being cut off from all things, when actually freedom is about entering into more and more, having the ability to do that. And so living freely comes to be seen as living in the service of the more and more, which is precisely what gives us the freedom to know more and more. You know when the opposite is happening, when someone talks about freedom in reactive ways. You know, I want to do my own thing, you're hindering me. This is the deluded kind of freedom that actually wants to eliminate, to cut off, and ends up being highly regulated. You know, I think one of the great challenges that we do face today, this is where it hits the cultural road as much as just our personal lives, is that the quest for freedom actually ends up producing more and more regulation, more and more policing, because freedom is assumed to be about isolation. And so the policing and the regulation comes in by preserving that isolation from each other. But of course, it imprisons us in the process. Very fundamental mistake about the nature of freedom. Ian Whitehead is another hugely influential philosopher on Iain McGilchrist's work, known for originating process philosophy, as it's called. And he makes this remark at one point. He says, there are no whole truths, all truths are half-truths. It is trying to treat them as whole truths that plays the devil. Now look, this has really significant import right now. We're speaking in a week in which Russia has invaded Ukraine, and for obvious reasons, there's a huge temptation to paint one side in a good light and the other side in a bad light. And that may well be necessary at this particular juncture, but it can't be the end point, because that would be to fall into half-truths. And the whole truth is that we have good and bad in us all. And I think the hope for peace now and at any time rests on everybody being able to own that which is bad in them as much as that which is good, which of course was the procedure that someone like Desmond Tutu was involved with in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So, you know, these insights have very substantial political import as well. When you try and divide the world permanently, you bring conflict. When you try to unite, not just by finding what you have in common, but by embracing the whole which is known by all people in their particular ways, that's where hope for the future might lie. It's expressed in a different way in this line from the poet Friedrich Hölderlin, whom Iain quotes as well. The heart's wave would never have risen up so beautifully in its cloud of spray and become spirit, were it not for the grim old cliff of destiny, standing in its way. And I like this particular reflection on this truth because it feels to me like it's touching on how death leads to a transformed life. Death is not that which makes life meaningless at the end. Precisely the opposite, the grim, seemingly old cliff of destiny standing in our way is actually that which invites, even at times feels like forces our heart's wave to lift to a newer perception that it wouldn't perhaps have ever risked suffering unless it had been forced to in some way, but that enables it to rise ultimately so beautifully in its cloud of spray and become spirit, become transformed. Putting it in another way, you know, nowadays we're struggling to know, for example, how metaphors aren't just colouring of what we say, but are actually pathways to truth. Again, in his conversation with Owen Barfield, David Bow makes a comment that he says elsewhere too, how even an equation can be a metaphor. He reflects on the famous Einsteinian question of E equaling mc squared. On one side of the equation is energy, on the other side of the equation is mass, seemingly a dualism there, but it comes together in the equation, and therefore the equation can be thought of as a metaphor. Metaphors link seemingly disparate things to show how they share something in common, which equations can do. It talks about how unknowing is crucial. And Whitehead again, Ian quotes as saying, not ignorance, but ignorance of ignorance is the death of knowledge. You know, you might say that relentless calls for enlightenment actually lead to endarkenment. And that perhaps explains something about where we've got to at this particular cultural moment, that the initial impulse in Blake's time for enlightenment, which is a good one, has now led 300 or so years on to a kind of endarkenment, because we want to force everything through the methods that produced enlightenment in this modern phase, notably science. But that has secretly and increasingly consciously to us now excluded parts of reality. And so enlightenment can lead to endarkenment. It's important always to remember your ignorance and not become ignorant of your ignorance, because that leads to the death of knowledge. Ian himself talks about how competition plus complementarity, the opposite of competition, actually leads to collaboration. And so needing to become aware of that too now. I think he must be saying this partly because so much of science has been told through the story of pure competition, the selfish gene, the struggle for survival, survival of the fittest. We're beginning now to see how complementary dynamics in life are crucially important as well. And that the two together, though, are going to be important to know how life is actually a process of collaboration. There's always a risk that when you swing from one you move to the extreme of another. And Ian, I think in this phrase, is saying, no, we need to bring two extremes together. In another way, this is to say that we need, I think, an older sense of justice, which is not about stressing the rights of isolated individuals, but rather is about being able to tune into the lives of those who seem different, and through that process of attuning, finding the accommodations, the collaborations. You know, much like energy is created by the coming together of opposites, magnetic poles come to mind, and so on. That's the kind of vision possibility that Ian wants us to have in front of our minds. And then, you know, another way that we struggle with this now, I think, is the consumerism that makes us forget that actually creativity requires resistance. And I think this is one of the reasons why craft, such as pottery, can be so refreshing and instantly carries spiritual associations for us, because it reminds us that it's the resistance in the potter's hands against the clay that makes for the beauty of the emerging form of the pot. Whereas in the consumer world, we're inclined to forget that because we just go and buy the pot that we want in a seemingly frictionless transaction. All we have to do, as it were, is bear the weight of the pot and put it into our bag. But the whole process of exchange is done just now by the tap of a piece of plastic. And so it makes us forget that actually resistance and struggle and suffering are part of the creativity of life. And with that forgetting comes the art of engaging in resistance and suffering, which the craftsperson, though, knows through their training. And we get a glimpse of, if we're not potters ourselves, when we actually maybe see a potter at work from time to time, and so feel we're watching life itself being performed for us. Iain stresses how the key ability is what he calls presencing the world, comprehending, not merely calculating, experiencing, not merely modeling, attuning, not merely measuring, understanding, not merely manipulating, and knowing that living and dying is not just being turned off or turned on, but is part of this encounter, part of the virtuous spiral. It's one of the reasons why artificial intelligence is so risky, because on the one hand, it makes us forget what comprehending is like in the effort to calculate, what experiencing is like in the effort to model, what attuning is like in the stress on measuring, what understanding is like in the stress on manipulating. But with this extra twist too, that because AI needs a world where calculation, modeling, measuring, and manipulating can work, it tends to force the world to become amenable in that way. And so leads to a world that's increasingly controlled, a world that's increasingly unfree, a world that increasingly is cut off from matters of spirit. That's the subtle risk of a world that too quickly becomes shaped by AI. We forget this other side of life. And it also leads to many of the deeper philosophical truths which we've encountered in recent weeks, how the all is many, not simply a singularity. And so Dante in the Paradise sees how the one is actually a diversity of many beings, all sharing and reflecting the one being. William Blake put it like this when he said, "He who would do good to another must do it in minute particulars. General good is the plea of the scoundrel, hypocrite, and flatterer. For art and science cannot exist but in minutely organized particulars. It's by contemplating the particulars that the universal appears, not by rushing straight to generalizations, because those generalizations will cut off aspects of reality, which is why Blake calls them the way of the scoundrel, the hypocrite, or the flatterer. They have a moral quality to them for Blake, and I think he's absolutely right about that. Now, in his new book, where much of this is discussed as well, Iain extends the original work of the master in his Emissary by partly expanding on the discussion of brain lateralisation. Since the initial book was published, he's of course had many dialogues with people, and so the deep truth that's expressed in the split between the left and the right hemispheres has become more and more clear to him. But he also wants to address this business of vision, and so he talks about how this book is in a way almost an initiation itself into seeing the world in this expanded way. He's interested in trying to help us to re-envisage things like attention, creativity, space, time, the sacred. These are the chapters of the new book. He wants us to reconceive our world, to know new ways of symbiosis between philosophy and science, to create a more truthful vision of who we are, not just the way the world is. He draws on figures like Blake to stress this, the observation that without contraries is no progress, and talks about the deep gravitational pull towards something ineffable, that if we can just for once get beyond words and reasons, is a matter of experience. So he's clear that this is about this virtuous spiral towards the ineffable. He uses the idea of limitation, another way of reflecting upon this much in the new book, and how thinking about limits helps us to understand how opposites go together. So here is a figure from a medieval image of the divine hand reaching into the world, out of the undifferentiated light into the differentiated world. It's quite a common way of representing the divine wellspring and source, because what it stresses is that creation is an act of limitation. You might say that opposites aren't separate, but they're dipoles that are connected. So inanimacy, for example, is the limit of animacy. Rest is the limit of motion. Unawareness is the limit of consciousness. And this is an ancient insight that Plato used as well. He talked about limits, or the Greek is peras, which if you ever get into esoteric thought is sometimes referenced, peras. And this is how the boundless becomes bounded in order to fall into a being from the one being. In fact, even the one, Plato or the Neoplatonists speculate, might be a limit on the infinite. And so you get these cascades or chains of being that are part of our experience. Iain is very keen on the figure who I very much value as well, to explore this a bit further, which is Nicholas of Cusa. And in fact, he told me that he realizes that a lot of Nicholas of Cusa's thoughts are quite similar to Carl Jung's. So this is a way of bringing in a bit of Jungian psychology, but also challenging Jungian psychology in a way, because I think that Nicholas of Cusa, with his overt theism, had that bit more connection to the whole of reality, whereas certainly Carl Jung, when he says he's talking as an empirical psychologist, is much more talking at the level of what shows up for him directly in the patient. It's only particularly in the later part of Jung's life when he became clearer about his own commitment to belief in God. In fact, as he says, not belief in God, but knowing of the divine, that he connects back fully, I think, into these older spiritual traditions. So, for example, Cusa, Nicholas of Cusa, talks about how good and evil don't come together in God, as if God must somehow embrace both good and evil, but rather that the true nature of good and evil, the seeming oppositional nature of good and evil at the infinite, like the lines coming together in the sky, are seen to be part of the one that exceeds them both. It's a bit like thinking about the light from the one hitting many fragments of mirror, glancing off in all different directions, some of which seem to radiate the light really clearly, some which seem to obscure, if not change the light, damage the light, render it unbeautiful. But the point is that it's still the one light reflecting off the many mirrors. The mirrors themselves aren't the sources. Cusa invites us to consider geometric exercises to consider how these oppositions actually meet in the infinite of the divine. He talks about thinking about the circumference of a circle that gradually, as the radius increases, becomes straighter and straighter, so that at infinity, the curved line of the circumference would hit and meet the straight line of a tangent. It's one of the reasons why this business about squaring the circle is so fascinating in spiritual traditions as much as in mathematics, because it seems to lead us towards this divine or eternal perception. Nicholas Accuser also wrote a book called On Learned Ignorance, where he says things like, the deeper we know our unknowing, the nearer we are to truth. He also makes very interesting remarks that chime with insights from David Bohm, which I thought I could throw in. He uses the metaphor of enfolding and unfolding, complicatio and explicatio. So the con there, the Latin for meaning with, con with, and ex meaning out. So hence the resonance with the implicate and the explicate order, and remarks that insofar as he, God, is the unfolding in all things, he is that which they are, just as in an image, the reality itself is present. So we're the unfoldings of the divine that are then enfolded back into the divine too. This dynamic image becomes so important, and it's another way of envisaging this sharing in the one light. Through being as many reflections of the one light, so too we're as many unfoldings and then re-enfoldings into the divine as well. Another very interesting part of Iain's new book is his use of another myth. And in fact, as one reviewer of the new book noted, this new myth might actually be the master myth of his second book, rather than the story of the master and his emissary from the first. And it's a myth from Native American culture, and in particular told by the Iroquois people, although I understand that a number of Native American cultures have comparable myths. And it's a story that's quite complicated in its full telling, but roughly speaking, it's the story of how the world's created through the action of twins. And these twins are born of the sky woman. And one twin can be called Sky Holder, and the other twin is called Flint. And Sky Holder is a kind of demiurgic creator of the world. Remember that demiurge means doing good for the people, and Sky Holder creates the world so as to connect everybody with Sky Mother, with the source from which he and his creation came. But Flint is jealous of his brother's capacity there. In fact, in some of the versions of the myth, it said that Flint was so keen to be born that he killed Sky Mother in order to be born quickly. Before he was born, you might say, Flint wanted to take control of his life and so killed his mother. Certainly jealous of his brother's creativity, and so is portrayed in the myth as either a villain or at least a trickster, wanting to manipulate the world, wanting to bend it to his way, associated therefore with chaos, rather than discernment, perception and order, and of course of openness therefore to more. You might say that Skyholder, the other brother, knows the being and the light from whence they came, but Flint wants to have that for himself. Now, as you can, I hope, already see that this resonates very powerfully with the master and his emissary. But Iain uses this now because in the myth, it stresses particularly the balance of the two, but with the sense of distance as well. The story goes that Skyholder realized what Flint, his brother, was doing, and realized that if he got too close to Flint, then he got caught in the games of control, which Flint was setting, trying to control Flint. So had to create the right distance from Flint in order to draw Flint's actions by a process of allure towards that which is good, beautiful, and true, towards being itself. And this distance, this separation, is a key part of the brain lateralisation thesis. Again, if you've read the book, you'll know that this is the role of the corpus callosum, the membrane that joins the two hemispheres, which, as Iain points out, seems to join as much by inhibition, by keeping things separate, as it does simply by crashing together, because if you crash together, you lose the distinctiveness of the points of view. And instead stresses the need for betweenness, interdependence, flow, these dynamics. And very remarkably, this ancient myth and those like it seem to capture that perception as well. But here, I wanted to draw towards some sense of how I feel personally. I can't go along with Iain the whole way, or at least offer a kind of critique, which I hope is in the spirit of a dualism and opposition that helps us to see more deeply itself. It's to, of course, be really grateful for all this work that Iain's done, not only because it makes such spiritual traditions plausible to people once more, but also because it makes me rethink and so deepen my perception of things as well. And I partly got onto this through discussions with Iain himself about particularly figures like Plato, but actually also by considering this myth, which is why I bring it in at this point, because, you know, like many myths, it has various different versions, and it feels like we need the different versions to get the full truth of the myth. So in another version, Skyholder realizes that he doesn't have to keep a right distance from Flint in order to draw Flint, but actually must imprison or defeat Flint. And I think there's a kind of truth in that as well. Skyholder is unshakable in his sense of belonging to Sky Mother, and so to the primal source of all being, the aboriginal one, before the division that led to him and Flint, and then also led to the demiurgic creation. And that in order to stay in touch with that oneness, there is the need on occasion to sacrifice something of our control, something of our sense of separation, something of that which would endarken the world, even if it were in the name of enlightening the world. And so there's echoes, I think, of that in the version of the myth that has Skyholder imprison or even destroy Flint. There's a sense in which part of this dynamic of interdependence and flow is also letting go of earlier perceptions, of even being rid of them on occasion, which is why the language of sacrifice is part and parcel of the spiritual tradition as well. It's a bit like what Blake says about the difference between dividing, which leads back to the uniting in the positive dualism, and the division that becomes a negation or a denial of the primary source. And so in its dividing, actually cuts off the route back because it's become so sure of its own atheism, you might say. There are points where we have to resist the opposite as much as find a way that it's united in the one. And I say this partly because I think it's the case, but also because I think it's a big issue in a lot of postmodern theology. And so this is to come to some concluding thoughts and remarks. The way it pops up on occasion is twofold, actually. Sometimes it pops up in terms of the nature of relationship and whether relationship in the world between ourselves is prior, is basic, is fundamental, or whether relationship is itself an expression of a higher vision, a deeper vision. And then also about the nature of suffering. What is the meaning of suffering? Which in a way is the most important question for us to consider. It's the stumbling block often for people with accepting spiritual vision. And so it's really worth thinking about properly. Now, Iain's a really good interlocutor on this because at least at times he takes quite particular views. Consider first the nature of relationship. He is explicit actually in settling on panentheism, which can be defined in different ways actually, but he defines it as the idea that there's God and then there's other than God that are part and parcel of reality. Whereas pantheism would just be saying there's an identity between God and the world. But also he refers to Indra's net, this story from Indian philosophy, which talks about how the world is like a net and it's where the nodes come together in this net that things or people, seeming objects, are formed. And it's an appealing image for those who like the idea that relationship is prior and basic, because of course it's the relationship across the net that brings the things into existence. And there's absolutely no doubt there's a deep intuition in that. If you think about notes in a tune, it's the relationship of the tune as a whole that gives the notes their meaning. But for me, it also speaks about the need for the holistic perception. And so points not just to this question of whether things or relationship are prior, but to the fact that the whole is the basic. And so for me, it takes me beyond just the dispute about relationship or things, but back to the dynamic vision of the one. And so Indra's net has to be presented in its entirety, not just as it were with one or two pieces, in order to show its significance and meaning. And then just to say something about the nature of suffering as well, which is important here, I think. Iain draws a lot on process philosophy, and in the theological appropriation of process philosophy, which he himself doesn't do, not regarding himself as a theologian, but in the theological appropriation of process philosophy, it's sometimes said that the world is needed by God, that there's an unfolding of the divine spirit in history, and that the divine is completed in history, therefore. And I think, and therefore that there's a kind of risk that God takes in creating, because the world can go wrong. Suffering obviously can drag people down as much as be seen as a pathway or portal to divine perception. And certain 20th century Christian theologians have been drawn to this because of the image of the cross, and also because of the horrors of the 20th century, and seen how it's not just that God knows of this suffering, but God is implicated in the suffering with all the possible ramifications of that, including one way of interpreting the phrase, the death of God. Now, I think we need another understanding of suffering, which is actually the traditional one, where God is said to be impassible, which isn't that God doesn't know suffering, but that God isn't changed by suffering. And I think this is a deep truth, actually, because, for example, if you think about a parent helping a child that's suffering, the parent both knows fully of the suffering and can empathize with it, which the child must feel, otherwise it will feel uncared for. But the parent must also know and therefore communicate that it exists in a place that's on the other side of the suffering, when the suffering has passed, and indeed when the suffering can be incorporated into the experience of the child. The parent enables that as well. And that would be more akin to the traditional understanding of God and the impassibility of the divine. I partly also say this because of being a psychotherapist, and one of the things which you have to work out and realize through experience in training as a psychotherapist are the kinds of suffering where you wouldn't be able to maintain being alongside someone who is suffering, whilst also being, as it were, beyond the person that's suffering. You might remember from the Dante talk that when Dante first enters hell, he faces suffering that he can't tolerate, and so frequently passes out. And it's partly by learning how to keep his mind while staying open to the suffering that he finds a way through hell and towards purgatory. And I think it's in this sense that God is the great companion, the fellow sufferer who understands. And that's actually how Iain Whitehead puts it. That's what we're invited to know within ourselves, but also to be able to trust in divine reality. So this reflection on relationship and the whole, and suffering and understanding suffering, but not being consumed by suffering, is to say that in a way, the spiritual quest, I think, is not at the end of the day about integrating dualities, but it's about appreciating how dualities offer us a golden string, to use Blake's metaphor, that lead us to heaven's gate built in Jerusalem's wall. Jerusalem's wall, in that sense, being the world in which the dualities exist, but through which is found the world from which the dualities sprang. It's a kind of combination of continuity and discontinuity. In other words, we're not actually other to God, as at least one definition of panentheism would stress. And if you think about it, that can't be the case, at least to me, because God can't be a thing. That would be to say that something is outside of God. And nothing can be outside of God, because that would be to be outside of being. Rather, God, as someone like Nicholas of Cusa would say, is already complete and full act, and that we are sharing in that act of God in our own limited ways that can become portal to a limitless appreciation of the divine, and indeed which would be our destiny in terms of traveling through purgatory and into paradise. Nicholas of Cusa puts it like this at one point. He says that God is possessed, which is a Latin word, which is a kind of combo meaning can and is. So God is can, God is, and God is also can is, the linking of the two. So to draw to a conclusion, this is to affirm dualities before, as always, but to ensure they don't slip into dualisms. Dualities remind us of the dynamic nature of the one, and that it's not a static singularity, that it's not a cut-off deistic source. And that is one of the most important parts, I think, of Iain's work, to remind us through the neuroscience that people find very compelling, that our experience of life, and therefore, because we participate in life, the nature of life itself is dynamic, a combination of the discerning and particular focus with the expansive, unknown awareness. They're crucially in the service of each other. And if we're to go on the virtuous spiral up in terms of our perception, the left must be in the service of the right, but the right too must be in the service of something greater than itself. The right hemisphere isn't the cosmos, but is itself a manifestation in limited form of the truth of all things. So just to briefly touch on this huge journey, which I feel I've been on over the last 4 weeks, and I hope that you have felt something of too. This is to remind us that if we bind to ourselves the joy, the winged life we destroy, to remember Blake's phrase, but if we kiss the joy as it flies, we live in eternity's sunrise. It's to remind us that whilst life is to awaken often in a dark wood and have to understand the nature of the darkness by first going through hell, that's only to appreciate how infernal freezing, as Dante described it in the floor of hell, can lead to paradisal transformation, because our desire combined with our discernment leads to an ever expansive vision of life. And just to touch on Plato as well, where I began in these 4 talks, we need to be drawn by the dynamics of our intellects for sure, but always fired, always ignited with the dynamics of love that is as much about yearning as it is about connection. But it will lead to connection in the way, because I think that dualities are always a precipitating of the capacity, not just to know more and more, but again, as Blake reminded us last week, to know the all. So let me draw to a close there to stop the share. And I hope that that has precipitated thoughts, questions, as before. I'll ask James to give us a 15-minute break now, which can be a stretch of the legs for you, or going into the breakout rooms, which you'll be invited to join if you want to air some of these thoughts that I hope the talk again this evening has prompted. And then we'll come back. Let's say we'll come back, because it's just a little, almost 20 past. Let's have a 15-minute break and say we'll come back at 25 to the hour for a final set of questions, comments, thoughts, which, you know, as before, I'll be really grateful for, because they often bring out the most interesting insights, in fact. So go into your breakout room or just have a stretch of the legs for 15 minutes, and we'll rejoin at 25 to the hour.
Okay, great. You should all receive the invitation to join the breakout rooms now. We can now start the Q&A, but first I'd just like to thank Mark for your brilliant presentation to finish off your 4 weeks, which have been an amazing journey that you've given us. So yeah, as usual, to ask your question, use the raise your hand function, or write your question in the chat. And with that, I'll give it back to you, Mark.
Great. Well, I'm just going to pick up on a couple of thoughts in the chat first, and then come. Thanks very much to those who are raising hands as well. Someone in the chat mentioned the physicist Carlo Rovelli, and I've just been reading Carlo Rovelli's Helgoland, his latest book, where he talks about relationality being the fundamental thing. And in fact, Iain, in talks at least, has, I think, referenced Carlo Rovelli as well. But it seems to me that Carlo Rovelli is partly doing that because he doesn't want to admit consciousness into the discussion. And so he describes consciousness as what you might call the rising significance of relationship, as if consciousness kind of emerges from relationship. Now, I don't quite know how that can be so. It seems to me that relationship assumes consciousness, not the other way around. But anyway, you can see how these kind of tussles go on now. Someone else remarked about the role of reconciliation. And in my sense of things, at least, what I'm in a way I'm arguing for is that reconciliation isn't the means to the full vision, rather transformation is, and that our efforts to be reconciled might well lead to the kind of transformations in ourselves as much as in those who were seeking to be reconciled with, that will lead all parties to higher vision of things. It's this sense that there's always more to move into through, you might say, secondary processes like reconciliation, similarly integration, and all these ways of thinking about things that try to combine or join or synthesize. I think that that's not the final step, you might say, but it can be a step towards that final step. Someone asked about the painter of the spiral ladder, the staircase to heaven, Jacob's ladder. That's William Blake. And someone also remarked that I should have spelt it complementarity, not complementarity, which is absolutely right. And also, actually, I realized that I spelt Charles Sanders Peirce's name wrong. I spelt it Pierce when actually it's Peirce. So that's another little correction from the slides. Another person remarked that in the Sufi tradition, it's often stressed that only God can know God. And I think that's absolutely right. And the mystery is that we're promised that one day we will know God as God, because our nature is divine as much as we will come to know the divine. And just as a little side remark, the best expression I've actually ever come across this, I've just visited from my shelf, is a book by Baliani. It used to be attributed to Ibn Arabi, but is now thought to be by one of his disciples, Baliani, and it's published by Beshara Publications as Know Yourself. And it's a thin, thin tome, but it's one of the most extraordinary evocations of that Sufi expression, which I think is common to theisms actually as well. So I could recommend that. And then someone also just asked me to talk about how these dualisms connect to the Trinity again. And I touched on that last week, talking about how being a lover of the beloved leads to loving, and being a knower of the known leads to knowing, and being a being with another being leads to a realization of being itself, that kind of Trinitarian awareness. There'd be another way of putting it, which relates more to what I was trying to say this week, which is that you might say that it's in the very nature of the divine to unfold, to expand, to create. It's not that there's the divine that then decides to create or unfold or expand. It is in the nature of divine life to do so. And that be partly what it's to say that God is infinite, not finite, or God is eternal, not temporal. And in Trinitarian theology, this is expressed by the idea that there's the Father aspect of the divine, which is the source. But that source within itself has two movements, which would be one, the kenotic movement, the overflow, the seeming giving away, which is captured in the Christ, the second person of the Trinity. But because what's been given away or what's been emptied out is itself divine, that is the action of the Spirit, the ecstatic action that, whilst is a movement within the divine, is a movement of the divine as well. And so is three elements within one. Now, we don't quite experience kenosis and ecstasis like that. You know, when we sacrifice, when we give away, it feels like we lose something ourselves, you know, often anyway. And when we have an ecstatic experience, we seem to step into another awareness of ourselves as if somehow that's different. But of course, that's because we experience life as human persons, not as the divine hypostasis, to use the Greek word. But that's at least a touch on the Trinitarian understanding of that. Rowan Williams, in his latest book, Looking East in Winter, talks about this a lot. And the reference there to looking east in winter is partly looking to the Eastern expressions of Christianity that have this notion that the way to talk about the one in the Christian tradition is in Trinitarian terms. That's how to understand the dynamics of monotheism. Now, I don't know whether that's even promote more questions, but that's at least to pick up some things from the chat. And Sandra has been waiting patiently first. So Sandra, please do, if it's possible to be short and punchy, because I've been long and lengthy, then that'd be great.
All right. Well, I'll be very short and punchy, Mark. Why do you think talking therapy works?
Well, maybe just thinking back to one thing, because it evokes in the person you're working with that there's another possibility for living, and that it requires encountering that other possibility, not just in yourself, but as it's precipitated in yourself by talking to a therapist. At first, therapy is often being the target for someone's suffering, complaint, agony, anger, all that kind of thing, which is a bit like the infernal state. Then it's holding all that agony whilst it begins to see how it can transform the purgatorial state. But then the paradisal state would be realizing that together there's a experience of life that we can both know, that was beyond anything we could possibly realize in the moment of suffering. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to happen in a linear process like that. There can be moments of one, then moments of the other, and maybe that's much more what it's like in earlier stages until things settle down and clarity emerges and so on. But perhaps something like that. You could talk about that in many, many ways, but to relate to what we've been saying. You're nodding, so I hope that makes some sense.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Let me go to Angelita, who's been waiting patiently for a little while as well. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much to Parry and all the participants, and to you, Mark, today for this wonderful conversation. My voice is coming to you from San Francisco in California. My voice is one of a descendant of the original people of the New World that was visited by the Europeans, shall we say, long ago. And so to see the story of the woman who fell from the sky was interesting to me. I felt like I remembered the story of God. Rumi, a beautiful poet, described God as two big men or two big people on a small boat running into each other and laughing. And I felt a little bit like I got run into today by that whole presentation. And I went, oh, I'm going to laugh about it. I'm going to be curious about it. I'm going to embrace it. And I'm going to, quick and punchy now, that was the intro, just say the use of the word myth to describe our origin stories, there may be another word. And, I sometimes make this point in scientific, I have some scientific background, among other things. I sometimes make this point by referring to the myth of Plato's teaching, or the myth of Pythagoras and what he knew after visiting Egypt. And so I refer to the European philosophers as proposing myths. And of course, this is not welcomed, and I'm categorized as something or other. But it does open, as you and as Heisenberg and as a lot of people refer to, options and probabilities and new ways of thinking and seeing and transforming our way of being together on this tiny boat where we inevitably will run into each other. So I just wanted to offer my my voice and my thoughts about the use of that word. And I've learned a lot today, and I thank you very much for that. I sit in curiosity and open-hearted, and it's been lovely. Thank you so much. And thank you to the Perry people and the wonderful people I met in my small group. That was lovely. We actually got to know each other. So a little bit.
Yeah, look, thank you for all those remarks as well. And my thought is that myth can be used in a number of ways, and not least in the pejorative ways that you so clearly prod and poke, and rightly do so as well. But I hope too that through the particularities of these different traditions and accounts of things, deeper truths can be seen. And I guess that's partly what precipitates with laughter. I mean, when you said that, even when you said two men originally, even if it was two human beings in the story, it's a bit like Desmond Tutu and the Dalai Lama. But yeah, I completely take your point. Yeah, it's a very good one. Albertina, thank you. Maybe I can unmute you. I don't think I can actually. If that's not going to be easy or work, then can you type it into the chat, and then I'll pick it up in the chat in a moment after I've come to the others. Okay, I'll tell you what I'm going to do actually. Also, I see that there's two more hands raised. Neil's.
Okay.
Excellent. Albertina, thank you.
Okay. So I am a great fan of yours, and my first reaction was, oh, Plato, I don't even going to watch this. It's a waste of time. Okay, and then I realized that once you were an Anglican priest and also a therapist, then you interpret philosophy in a way that it becomes just poetry or pure divine knowledge. And I want to congratulate you. And then I want to, music certainly should be the ladder from hell to paradise. And Paris Center will start a Zoom meeting about music tomorrow. And I want to trace a parallel about how the left side of the brain sort of trample on the left side trample on the right side. Insofar as today I've just read that the James Webb telescope has a mirror that has 18 smaller segments mirrors. And then now they are coupling the 18 mirrors in order to take pictures as far as when the Big Bang happened. And to understand what they are doing, of course, they are doing this in nanoscale. We can imagine that the big mirror is the size of the United States, and just one segment is the size of Texas. And you have to couple together like the pieces of a jigsaw, just 2.5 inches. So we are able to do that. But then to make human beings angels, what is necessary from my viewpoint? It's well known that the kids, babies from 8 months to 18 months have the greatest musical ability to discern absolute notes. And all this is lost at 7 years old. So if the moms were taught music, it would, the baby inside the womb hears music, even the language you speak. And then the brain is not only the ear, the brain is being formed at the same time. And then what's the cost of raising women to know music and be able to teach kids until 7 years old to become musicians? And all this is a pearl, and it's thrown to the trash due to the way the history of mankind has unfolded. And then I would really appreciate that you can sort of saying something about music, because music was totally left, and I'm sure you must do something about that.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mentioned just, but you're right, and just in passing, talking about how the note in a tune requires the sense of the whole in order to make sense in the tune. But music is a hugely powerful way of getting a felt sense of many of these things that we've been talking about, because, you know, it's not rational, but it has a kind of reason within it, notably harmony and discord and so on. There are the laws of harmony that are honoured in the breach as much as in the keeping, of course, and how it's both physical, it's vibrations on the air, and it's spiritual, because the meaning of the music clearly isn't just the vibrations on the air. So, you know, it's good to have that stressed again in your remarks there, that music has this capacity not just to convey emotion, but to convey shift perception as well, because of its undeniable qualities, and, you know, the teaching of it, and therefore it's absolutely vital. And the music of the spheres in spiritual traditions and so on is pointing to that way of engaging with reality that actual music, literal music, you might say, conveys as well. So yeah, that's just to remark a bit. I'm going to push on slightly, if that's all right, unless there was something that you wanted to add to what you said, just because of the time there, Bettina, but I don't want to just cut you off if there's something really important.
Yeah, I know. You see, but music has been taught as something for elites, and Friedrich Nietzsche decried that, and Ludwig II made the castle in Germany to honor Wagner. And so we should teach music for everyone, not as something as elite to be isolated.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely point well made. How can we possibly know reality unless we know music? I completely agree. Yeah. And not as elite. Yeah. Niels, let me come to you. And again, Niels, I'm just watching the time. So if you were able to restrict yourself to one comment or thought or question, that'd be great.
Yes, I've got a whole series of them, but I won't bother you with that. But there's one thing, Ravelli and Helgoland, that was interesting with his relational and information, and he called it a small miracle. And that interests me, because I know what a miraculous algorithm looks like, but I won't bother you with that. So the same principle applies to a real miracle, and that is the problem is the complexity, the dynamic complexity that we see in nature, in everything we encounter. We see it in the structure of the brain. It's so complex, we don't think we can actually understand how the brain does that. But I have, if anyone is interested, I have the answer to that, and it's very simple. But music and the Trinity in particular, I have lived in the Trinity since I was a little boy of 5 or something, and it is a power. It's like a power that's inside you that can guide you into all truth, I believe. So there, and it relates to, I found out because of my algorithms. I then, a friend of mine said, have you read a course in miracles? And I said no. And when I looked at that, and already at that time I had an idea that God's voice was actually in our right brain. I worked that out by just experience. and I found in Achim that the ego is in the left brain. That's the one that promotes itself, projects itself into the world, whereas the right brain is the divine, inspired thing. It's actually connected, according to Achim, it's actually connected to the divine. We're all connected, we're all parts of the mind of God. That's what Achim says.
I'm going to leap in again, Niels, because
yes,
I know
okay.
that there's a chap called Galaxy who
yes.
Has been waiting as well. And
yes. Mark, I would
yeah.
like to have a chat with you at some time privately. We could do a Zoom, perhaps.
Okay, well, look, my email is available online, so do be in touch.
I'll contact you. I like all you have brought up. It really is inspiring.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I mean, I'm sure you're right that all these things that we talk about are invitations not just to think, but to experience, even if it feels it's right on the horizon of our awareness for some of us at least. So yeah, thank you for that. Galaxy, let me come to you, and then we'll draw to a close.
Okay, thanks, Mark. First of all, I'd like to say thank you for your words and also for your work with Rupert Sheldrake. I'll watch it and listen intently to it. Just a question, it's in relation to your own upbringing, your own conditioning of content. Just like, I don't want you to elaborate long about it, but how hard was it for you to go through that conditioned content in your own life, from coming into the world through the parents, through the schooling, through the conditioning of religion, through academia. Like, was there a point in your life when there was a transformation where you had the insight in the seeing that you were able to let go? Could you describe anything related to that?
Hey, look, thank you for your question. And I mean, the truth is it's been hard. And at times, I felt disastrously hard. I've had breakdowns and very desperate times, and it's only latterly that I can see that they were, I hesitate to say necessary, because I don't want to fall into the sense that there's something masochistic or sadistic about the spiritual quest. But I think key moments for me came in learning how to stay with what's difficult, and in that sense accept it. Not accept it as in I want it, I'm just going to live with it, but accept it as part of my path, at least, if you like. And things that helped with that were my own therapy, undoubtedly, but also I did a very good course in meditation, which was actually a 3-year course that showed you how to meditate, a bit like learning to ride a bike. And I had no idea up to that point that you could learn it in that way. And then, a final thought just to offer for now is the growing sense that it's not just my struggle or my quest, that's really the defining part of all this. That's a necessary part, because it's about me wanting more, not just being satisfied with life, and so looking for more. But that increasingly I feel it's about realizing that God, the good, beautiful, and true, the people and spirits that speak through these traditions, some of which we've touched on, for me, Blake and Dante are particularly important. They're reaching out to me as well, and they're reaching out to you, and they're reaching out to us. And to become more aware of that, and how to become co-creative, collaborate, feel the presence of all that, is absolutely fundamental as well. I think it's the reason why Jesus could make comments like, you know, knock and the door will be open, seek and you will find. These are deep spiritual truths, not just kind of hopes or aspirations. So maybe, you know, there's a duality here, even that there's times when suffering feels completely unnecessary and pointless, and
could you
feel stuck, and other times where you realize it is the transformation.
Is it possible that, like, if you had to put another word in for suffering, what would it be?
It's a good one, suffering, because that's what it feels like. But it would be, you know, it'd be part.
Is conditioning enough? In that sense, like that conditioning can almost, like in the suffering, the suspension of the suffering allows the suffering to expand itself, to transform in its own, if you understand what I mean, within the suffering.
I mean, certainly we are conditioned, but I think, you know, and that's the personal conditioning, the cultural conditioning, all those things. But I think the realization is that the conditioning is the way, not somehow going beyond, above, underneath the conditioning. And similarly, that's why suffering is this difficult but amazing thing, that it is the way. As much as the seeking of beauty and so on as well. That's why it's not just masochistic. You know, that certainly, you know, as I understand it now from the Christian point of view, that's one of the meanings of the incarnation, that the particular experience of being a human is, in the time and place, is the pathway to the divine, because it's the dance of the divine. So these are big things we're touching on again, but maybe that is some response to what you're wondering about, at least.
Yes. I mean, there was just a beautiful analogy I heard today, where somebody left home to go on the quest, on the journey, and travel to many parts of the world, to many cultures, and searching, and finally didn't find anything, and came back home, and the door was open.
Thank you. Hey, look, I'm going to draw things to a close. I'm just doing a quick scan to make sure there's nothing. There's very nice comments and interesting comments in the chat, so do have a quick look at the chat. Someone just said, why have we got stuck with this left brain hemisphere? I mean, Iain, to give the last word to Iain, since we've been talking about his work and gained so much from his work this evening, really puts, I think, down to power, that we live in a time where the left hemisphere's capacity to make models and manipulate the world, combined with the technological ability to actually realize that tangibly in the world around us. You know, the mechanical philosophy existed before the machine, because the machine couldn't actually be made that the mechanical philosophers envisaged. Well, now the machine sort of can be made, and it in part is of our benefit, for our benefit. Look at how we're talking to each other. But there's this risk always that it forgets its own ignorance. And so that, I think, is the key importance of Iain's work. He's not ultimately in the business of denying reality in the modern world at all. He uses neuroscience, for goodness sake, but he wants us desperately to be able to see through and beyond it, with it. So that's to, you know, to stress again the brilliance and significance, huge significance of his work. James, let me hand over to you.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thank you all so much for today, and thank you so much, Mark. Well, I know it's a bit late, but I don't know if you've got any final remarks to give us just to finish your four weekends.
I feel like I've tried to give a final blast a couple of times now, so I won't try a third time, much as I love threes.
Okay, well, great. Well, thank you again so much for all these 4 weekends. It's really been an incredible journey and so much to mull over and think about. So really, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining us again. Just before we go, I'd just like to invite you all to, I know it's been mentioned already, the first of 2 sessions on music and numbers with Dr. Donna Coleman and special guest Dr. Kevin March, where through a combination of lectures and performances, the 2 will explore the philosophical relationship of music and numbers in tonalities, intervals, series, and symbols. And also, I hope to see you all next week, where on Saturday we will have the lecturer and psychologist Mark Sabin talking to us about Jung's 2 personalities, psychological implications. And on Sunday, we will have a discussion between the president of the Pari Center, Santina Sapadini, and scholar Mauro Bergonzi on dualities and non-dualities. In the meantime, though, you can contact us on our website, social media, or email at eleanor@paricenter.com to contact Eleanor. Thank you all again for joining us. Thank you so much, Mark, for sharing with us today and this month. And we'll see you again soon here at the Pari Center.